Hello everyone, this is Ben, and in this video what we're going to do is talk about the question of whether or not evolution can explain morality. I think that this idea that evolution can, explain morality is something that in the minds of a lot of people seems like it's very powerful. It's a very powerful argument, whereas a biblical view of morality would be that morality seems to have a foundation in God's commands and in God, and that God is both a good being, but also that God commands things. And the problem with you could say, like, well, what's the contradiction? What's the real difference between biblical morality and evolved morality? Well, if morality is the product of evolution, then morality is not, there is no true moral knowledge. You don't really know that it's wrong to steal or murder or that sort of thing. Whereas the Bible seems to directly affirm that these are real objective facts about reality. Whereas if morality is the product of evolution, then it's essentially like an instinct that just has evolved into us, and a different instinct could have evolved into us. So we'll get into that as we go, I guess. Might be the best way to get into it. We'll get into more of the details about that as we go. But what I thought it would be good to do is take a look at this argument and essentially just analyze it brick by brick, stone by stone. We don't have to, I guess my point is, you don't have to know where you're going with your argument all the time. You can just carefully analyze things, and you'll arrive at the truth as long as you're actually careful. So I'm not going to respond to this objection in ways that I have responded to it before, because I thought it would be fun to go about it a different way. Not that there's anything wrong with the way I've responded to it before, but I think it's healthy to kind of think through things as sort of like mental exercise, just like physical exercise for the body. It's not something you do one time and then you're just in shape forever. Mental training is the same way. So what we're going to do is, I guess the first thing we need to do is think about knowledge itself. Like, what does it mean? What does it mean to say that you know something? That seems obviously relevant, because if we're going to talk about knowing that some things are good and some things are bad, some things are moral, some things are immoral, that's a claim to knowledge. And so the question becomes, well, what does it really mean to say I know so and so to be true? Well, first of all, the basic definition for knowledge is the three-part definition, or the JTB definition. As my understanding goes, it's the three-part definition of knowledge is not really accepted today. It's not that these three parts are no longer part of it. It's that there's a lot of debate about there clearly needs to be another part, but no one has really come up with a good idea for what that fourth part would be necessarily. But the basic JTB is not really controversial, and it's sufficient for our needs today. We don't need to get into like the interesting examples. But JTB, justified true belief. Okay, so let's take an example of my brother. My brother loves the University of Georgia football team. He speaks of the University of Georgia as we and us. When Georgia wins, he says we won, and when Georgia loses, he said we lost. He loves the University of Georgia. So my brother will generally believe, especially when he was younger, he would just believe that Georgia was going to win every single game they ever played, So, for him to know that Georgia is going to win, the first thing he has to do is actually believe it. So, like, for you to have knowledge, the first thing you have to do is have some sort of proposition, some sort of statement that states a truth. And you have to believe that. Okay, I think that's obvious. The next part is that your belief has to actually correspond to reality. So if you believe that Georgia's going to win on Saturday, but they don't win, then you can't really be said to know that they were going to win, because you obviously didn't have knowledge because you were wrong. Okay, because they didn't win. Okay, but the next point is really crucial as we move forward. To have knowledge, you have to have a justified true belief. And what that means is that there has to be some sort of justification for your belief. You can't just, in other words, like, if he just says that Georgia's going to win every single game they play in, and then sometimes, of course, they do win, and then he'll say, see, I knew it. I knew that they were going to win. Well, he didn't really know it. He just said that every single time they play. So he didn't know that it was going to happen because he had no justification. It's just like I've watched true crime documentaries many times, and there's always some older lady in the life of the victim who says that she knew that this was going to happen, that this bad thing was going to happen, and you can't help but wonder. I don't know, but I can't help but wonder. Maybe you just worry constantly about all sorts of dramatically horrible things happening all the time, and then when it does happen, then suddenly you knew it, but you didn't really know it because you had no justification. So if you just, I think we all get that, or maybe if you just guess correctly, then you don't really know. You didn't have knowledge. So knowledge for you to really know something means that you have a justified true belief. And your justification needs to not be just totally arbitrary. Like if you just rolled a dice and that's how you came to your conclusion, and you just guessed or you just made up something. Well, if you have no justification for your belief, then someone else like me can reject your belief. And why can't I reject it? I can reject it just as arbitrarily as you, and you don't have any force against me. So that kind of lays some groundwork for us to move forward. So the next question becomes like, well, okay, what sorts of things can we know? And one of the classic questions that teenagers often arrive at is the question of sensory knowledge about the external world. Before me, on the desk before me, there is a red cereal bowl. There is a cell phone, a remote control, an ace bandage, and an empty Coke bottle. So why don't we just focus on the red cereal bowl? I look out at the desk in front of me and I see a red cereal bowl. Plastic bowl, empty with a spoon in it. So I see it and I form the belief that therefore it is there. But the question becomes like, how do I know that it is there? Well, I know it's there because I see it. So my justification for my belief is the fact that I see it there. Well, someone could argue that, like, what if other people who come into the room and they see the same cereal bowl, what if it actually looks blue to them? But everything that it looks red to me, it looks blue to them, and then they call it red because we all, call it, because we're talking about the same bowl, but what they actually see is blue. Like, how do I know that it's actually a red bowl? Or alternatively, you could ask a different question, like, how do we know we're not all plugged into the Matrix? I don't know if you've seen The Matrix, but The Matrix is a classic movie that raises what philosophers have long called the brain in the vat problem. Like, if your brain was literally in some sort of vat of fluids keeping it alive, you could, theoretically, like, connect all your nerves to wires or some sort of machine that could feed you all the sensory inputs, then you could sort of live in a imaginary, illusory world. So how do you know really that, like, there's a cereal bowl on the desk You could be in the Matrix and there's no cereal bowl on the desk. The spoon is not real, right? That's from the first Matrix movie. There is no spoon. You are just being fed. Your brain is just being fed sensory inputs, but there's actually no spoon there. So, that being said, this is a question that needs to be. Philosophers take these questions seriously. No question is off subject and off the table in philosophy. And the question becomes like, okay, how do I know that the cereal bowl is real? Well, one way to go about it is the way René Descartes went about it. René Descartes, I think he lived in the 1600s. I don't remember exactly when Descartes lived. Let's look him up. But anyway, René Descartes took what's called the Rationalist Approach. He wanted to, born 31st of March 1596, died 11th of February 1650, age 53. And of course he's French with a name like Descartes. Okay. How did he approach these questions? What he wanted to do was ground our knowledge in rigorous logical reasoning. So, because there are things that, like, even if I was plugged into the Matrix, even if I was like a brain in a vat, there would be knowledge that I could still have. Like, I would know that 1 + 1 does not equal 2. And that knowledge is not based on sensory inputs, like empirical observations. It's not based on the sense of sight, the sense of smell, the sense of hearing, touch, any of that. It's based on sort of an observed, once you understand what the statement is saying, 1 + 1 = 2, then you sort of mentally observe it. It's sort of an observed idea mentally that would have to be true. And so things that through a purely mental world would not be affected by this sensory input problem, or this illusion problem. So, for example, there are purely philosophical arguments for God's existence, and so none of that would be affected. We've talked about that on this channel other times. None of that would be affected. And while that's all that's wonderful, there's a vast realm of human knowledge that we would like to be able to affirm and not doubt, that seems like if we took this skeptical approach, that we wouldn't know. So what René Descartes did is he said, okay, his idea was, what if there was a demon that was, so he's not thinking about a computer and being plugged into the Matrix. So he in 1600, he's imagining things a little bit differently. I don't know, 1630. Okay. He's saying, what if there's like a malevolent demon which has supernatural powers that's trying to trick me, trying to deceive me in every chance, so that I will never arrive at actual justified knowledge, or as we say, true justified beliefs, that none of my beliefs will actually be true or justified. So how can he know that his beliefs are justified? Because such a demon could exist. There's no logically, there's no problem logically with it. So how does he know that that's not going on all the time? René Descartes, what he said was, well, for the demon to do that, the demon would still have to be tricking me. And so therefore he arrives at a contradiction, because the demon cannot trick him into thinking that he exists, because he would have to exist to be tricked into thinking he exists. So the demon can't trick him about everything. So this is where you get René Descartes' famous statement, I think, therefore I am. Okay, so then Descartes went on from there with that as like a basis, and he was able to make more logical moves until he gets to an actual his version of the ontological argument for the existence of God, which is a purely philosophical argument, and there are many varieties. The best, I think, is to my knowledge, is Alvin Plantinga's more modern version. But yeah, I think therefore I am also in Latin is cogito ergo sum. Okay, which I don't know Latin, but I mean it's famous. Like everybody's heard it. But anyway, Rene Descartes does that, and once he's able to make that move to God's existence, then he says, okay, God, being a good God, would not deceive my senses, and so therefore I can trust my senses. Okay, now, as interesting as all of that is, as best I understand it, the consensus of philosophers today is that, there may be some debate about ontological arguments for God's existence, and especially his, but the consensus among philosophers today is that Rene Descartes was too hard on himself, that he placed on himself too high of a burden of proof, and he didn't have to ground everything in pure reason like this. Interestingly, Rene Descartes was a Christian, of course, and interestingly, another Christian came along named Emmanuel Kant. Let's see when Kant lived. I can't ever remember when these guys lived exactly. So Emmanuel Kant, right, okay, so born April 22nd, 1724, died February 12th, 1804. So Kant came at it like a different way. And Kant said he wanted to refute pure reason, so he critiqued reason itself. It's called Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And he said that there are good arguments for the beginning of time and against the beginning of time, and they're both totally rational, undeniable logical arguments. Therefore, you can't trust logic. And then he said that we can't trust our senses because they could be a distortion, and he made this noumenal phenomenal distinction between where the noumenal is the realm of reality where God would live. Kant was a Christian too, but the phenomenal is the realm of our sense experiences, and they could be distorted. So, and then he also tried to ground morality in reason. But that confuses people because that Kant was not someone who's going to say that he's got a rational basis for morality. He kind of assumed basic moral principles and then tried to work out based on pure reason, like a moral system. Because in his day, people were obsessed with the idea of coming up with moral systems that just allowed a pluralistic society to get along. Whereas before Kant's day, the moral systems were basically focused on how to live the best life possible, to live the truly good life, which is called virtue ethics. But Kant came in and it was more like get along. I forgot what the name of it is, but like the ethical theory was quite different. But these are massive names in philosophy. But anyway, the consensus today is that Kant was too hard on, not Kant, but Rene Descartes placed too high of a burden of proof on himself. He didn't have to go to that level. The consensus today is that you are rationally justified in just looking at the table and seeing the bowl on the table, then therefore there's a bowl on the table. So, it's like this. Let's say that here's the classic example. You are walking down the road and you look out into a field. There's a farmer's field. And you look out into the field and you see a sheep. And then you form the belief that you see a sheep in the field. And the justification for your belief is that you see the sheep. And you form the belief. And so the question becomes like, well, then do you have knowledge of the presence of the sheep in the field? This is a very simple situation, So then the question becomes like, okay, this is the counter example to kind of like, this is sort of the added part of the example to help us understand it. What if the farmer comes up to you, and the farmer who owns the field, and you know this farmer to be someone who knows his farm and his fields very well, and to be an honest and reliable farmer, and he says to you that at this distance, the distance between you and the sheep, that he has a sheepdog that looks very much like a sheep, that is indistinguishable, from a sheep at this range. Well, let's say 100 yards, or I don't know, whatever distance you think would make sense. Okay, so what you would have now is what's called a defeater, and specifically an undercutting defeater. He didn't give you a reason to think it was the sheepdog instead of the sheep, but he just undercut your justification for thinking that it is a sheep. Okay, so in that situation where he comes up to you and says that, now you have a good reason to think that maybe there's no sheep out there. But what if he had never come up and said that to you? Then in that situation, what should you believe? Well, the thing is, you could say, well, it's logically possible, even if he didn't come up to me, it's logically possible that, like, he could have come up to me. There's no, like, it's not like, 1 + 1 = 85, for him to come up to me. That would, it's logically impossible for there to be a world where 1 + 1 = 85. Of all the possible worlds that could exist, there is no world where 1 + 1 = 85. But there is a world where the farmer comes up to you logically. That may not be the actual world. But the thing is, if it's logically possible that he could come up to you, then you could say, well, basically all of my sensory knowledge, it's always logically possible that there could be a defeater. And so then you run into some problems, like, so if you want to be skeptical of all of that knowledge, you run into some problems where it's like, okay, but it's also logically possible that I could have a defeater for the defeater. And then it's logically possible that I could have a defeater. And then it's logically possible that I could have a defeater. And so you run into this sort of vicious circle and infinite regress of logically possible defeaters, and it kind of gets you nowhere. Another issue, and this is really the one to think about here. In the event that all you can do is believe in the existence of the sheep or not, you can doubt and be unsure, or you can think that there is no sheep there, but in a simple way, you're either going to believe that there's a sheep there or not. In the event that you have justification for the sheep because you see the sheep, and you have no defeaters, what is the most rational thing to do? In that situation, what is really the rational thing to do in that situation? Believe in the sheep. That's really the consensus today. That what really should you do in that situation where you have justification for the presence of the sheep and there's nothing on the other side? Then what really, makes the most sense to do is believe in the existence of the sheep. So, what's the most reasonable? I'm trying to think of the way I was putting it the other day. I don't remember, so we'll have to say it the way we're going to put it today. The classic way that this is said is that you're within your rational rights to believe in the existence of the sheep. Another way I like to think about it is that you're either going to believe in one thing or the other thing, and which one really makes the most sense to believe in? The one thing that you have justification for. So, that being said, we could start to say, okay, we could apply this to the moral sense. And we could say, okay, we have the five senses, but we also have this strange sense experience of good and evil. There are people who take pure pleasure in mutilating children. And we all sit back and we say, that's wrong. We have this sense of how wrong that is. It's not like the other senses, because your eyes tell you that the sheep is there. But if you saw, someone raping a child out in the field, then your eyes would tell you that that is happening. But your moral sense would tell you that that should not be happening. And the moral sense is like our other senses. I can't look at the moon and see the flags that the astronauts put on the moon because my sense of sight has limitations. But there are some situations that are right in front of me and sort of obvious, like the red bowl, the empty cereal bowl on the desk in front of me. I can see that quite easily. Whereas the moral sense can have the same sort of problem. Like if we saw someone, raping a child out in the field, our sense of sight would make it clear that that's happening, as long as it's not too far away. And then our moral sense would make it clear to us that is bad, that should not be happening, that no more of this. We've got to do, something to put a stop to this. This is wrong. Okay. And what I want to say to you is that in the absence of a defeater, that moral sense is justified. Now, there are some situations where the moral sense could be kind of... there are some situations that are like the flag on the moon, where it's very difficult to tell what exactly the right thing to do is. It's you're trying to peek into, minute details of morality, I guess. So the issue becomes okay, are there any defeaters for the moral sense? Well, one defeater that people raise is the defeater that not all humans agree on what is right and what is wrong. But that gets a bit complicated because the disagreements are largely about the more difficult situations where you're trying to look in minute details of morality. And a lot of times the disagreements about morality are really they're really rooted in other questions. So a lot of moral commands are really based in ontological or metaphysical presuppositions that people have. And those metaphysical presuppositions will sort of undercut the justification for a moral sense. So so for example, if you believe in the overall Christian worldview, then the Christian worldview teaches that anyone that is a Christian is now a child of God, and you're basically the highest royalty possible. And so therefore it seems immoral for that person to be a slave. Whereas if you believe in Hinduism and you believe in karma, then the ideas of karma would say that if a person's born a slave, it's because they did evil things in a past life, and that's why they're paying for it. Now, that being said, that's really kind of a side question. It's not really a moral question because it's in other words, moral questions are about the way the world ought to be, and ontological questions are about the way the world is. So, but you can derive, if you have an overriding sort of moral guideline, the overriding moral guideline in the Christian example and in the Hindu example are actually the same. What they're doing is they're saying you've got to put that person in the best possible situation, and that person who's in the Hindu system, that person has sinned and done wrong things, and therefore that person deserves this punishment, and there's a sense of the importance of that person in that Hindu system. And in the Christian system, there's also a sense of the importance of that person, but it works differently when you get to the specific morals of whether or not you should free the slave based on your overall worldview. So, the moral sense can be cloudy, and it can be uncertain, and it's not a perfect sense, sensory knowledge, but nonetheless, it still represents real sensory knowledge. And sometimes what exactly you should do morally will be affected by other facts. So for example, if you know that, like, if you're a police officer and you see a car speeding down the road, okay, and driving at a breakneck speed, if you know that there's a woman in serious labor in that car, then you will, clear the pathway in front of them to get them to the hospital more quickly. But if you know that that's like, some crazy violent meth head in the car, then you will not do that. You will try to stop the car and apprehend the person, take him to the jail, and arrest the person. So the moral system isn't really different, even though what the right thing to do in each situation is different. And that's just based on, factual information that then allows you to apply the morality differently. And so your overall worldview could be that. And essentially, your overall worldview would clearly represent a different culture, whether it's an Indian Hindu culture or a Western Christian culture. Now, that being said, the more interesting question I wanted to talk about today, and maybe there's other things we could talk about with the cultural relativism question that we're not going to talk about today, because what I really wanted to talk about is the evolution question. Because people feel like a lot of times, some people haven't encountered the question of evolved morality, but some people have. And once they have, it tends to be a very powerful idea. Because what evolution is doing is it's actually functioning as a defeater for the moral sense. That's what people are saying, is that morality just comes from evolution. So what they're saying is that, like, life evolved on this planet, and we just evolved like an instinct to protect babies, and it's just sort of an animal instinct and urge, just like you have an animal urge to have sex and to make babies. You also have an animal urge to protect babies. And it's just something that evolved in us because, over the hundreds of millions of years that life has existed on this planet, living things will just have random mutations for a variety of reasons. And those mutations, some of those mutations will make them more likely to have children, and some will make them less likely to have children. And so the ones that make the species or the animals, the group of animals, more likely to have children, those will get passed on to the next generation and predominate and become dominant. And you may actually wind up with a whole nother species, especially if there's an environmental change where there's there'll be a real need for like a different way of life for that species or that animal population. And so you could say, like, okay, well, it's obvious that animals, just evolved an instinct, sort of an urge to make babies. Well, then it makes sense that, like, protecting babies would also be the same thing. So what they're saying is evolution, provides a defeater for your sense. That, remember we talked about you were looking out in the field and you use your eyes to see that someone was raping a baby. You are a child. You also, what they're doing is they're saying that moral sense itself is defeated by evolution. It's like evolution is basically the farmer. And it's a well-justified theory, and so it's got a lot of credibility, and it's saying, okay, your moral sense is actually just a byproduct of evolutionary process. People tend to understand that. Now, part of the problem with that is that, like, we could have evolved differently, and so, like, if we had evolved from bees, then it's very possible that fertile females would fight each other to the death. and we would think that was morally correct, right? Because that's what queen bees do. Maybe we all know some queen bees, right? They, or if we had evolved from alligators, then it would have made sense for fathers to eat their own young, and that's because that's how alligators reproduce. The mother lays lots of eggs, and then the slowest ones get eaten by the father. Okay, and the fastest ones get away, and so it's survival of the fittest, and evolution right there. Whereas what we don't do that, we think that anything bad happening to a baby is bad. Well, you could see how that would also be an aid to survival, and an evolutionary benefit. So that's the idea. Now, there's a huge problem with that, and just working in this basic concept of justification and warrant. So warrant is when your justification is strong enough that you really should believe the proposition. So, like, my justification for believing that the bowl is on the desk in front of me is that I see it there. And that justification is so strong that, it really becomes like a moral norm that, like, I really should believe that it's there. So it's warranted for me to believe that it's there. So the thing is, if evolution is true and there's no God, then we run into all sorts of problems. Now, if evolution is true, but God directed it, then we don't have those problems. But then that's kind of uninteresting. But so the question becomes, like, evolution, we're not talking about evolution just causing you, in other words, like, if evolution can undercut the moral sense, why can't it undercut the other senses? People are very quick to believe that evolution can undercut the moral sense, but then, like, when you start raising the question of, like, well, why can't it undercut our other senses? Then all of a sudden, evolution would always cause you to have, those senses would be, amazingly accurate and they would be wonderful at justifying your knowledge about reality. Whereas the moral sense, oh no, that's incredibly unjustified. That's all just nonsense. And well, see, the thing is, the Bible largely contains moral knowledge. God doesn't seem to come to give us scientific knowledge in the scriptures, but he sure did come to give a whole lot of knowledge of good and evil and right and wrong. Especially it actually goes beyond what the people knew or believed at the time. It's actually innovative moral knowledge. It's whereas the scientific knowledge, you can make a case here or there that there's scientific progress in the Bible, but it's pretty minimal at best. Whereas the moral knowledge is like light years beyond wherever they were at the time. It's become an amazing force for good. But if there is no moral knowledge, if all moral knowledge is defeated, then the Bible is essentially a big book of hokey baloney. And Christianity is a big book of hokey baloney. And a lot of things are a big book of hokey baloney. Because what you do is you have a lot of people who sort of give lip service to the belief that evolution undercuts, is an undercutting defeater for morality, for the moral sense. But then out of the other side of their mouth, they want to make all sorts, they're staunch moralists, about how immoral this and immoral that, even people on the left who, would probably love to defend atheism, then out of the other side of their mouth, they're going to be mad about racism, mad about misogyny, mad about bigotry. We live in an oppressive world, and they're going to make statements like, these things should be done to these people. Like, they'll say things, like, people make moral pronouncements all the time, like, defund the police. Why should we defund the police? Because the police are all racist. Why is that a bad thing? Well, because it's a bad thing to be racist. So, we should do this, we should do that. This is wrong, and this other thing would be good. These are all moral judgments. So, like, as soon as you do that, you're asserting moral knowledge. That what the right thing to do is. You assert it all the time, But, like, how can that be? Like if evolution really is such a wonderful undercutting defeater, and the thing is, there's tremendous evidence for evolution. So it does seem like it would be a really good undercutting defeater, unless, of course, God directed evolution so that we would have correct moral knowledge, so that the moral sense would be reliable. So here's the key point to understand at this point. A good argument can be made that evolution would actually undercut all of our beliefs, not just our moral knowledge. So the thing is, we tend to smuggle into our view of how evolution functions. We smuggle in religious loading into that. So we tend to think that, like, okay, evolution is a long process that took hundreds of millions of years, and that created our brains, from lower animals all the way up to the human brain. And that created our brain. And our brain was created through that process, and then our brain, like, forms our beliefs about the world, what we believe to be true about the world, and then those beliefs cause us to perform actions or behaviors. And so if we perform the incorrect behavior, then we will die. So, like, for example, if a frog, is sitting there, and here comes a fly buzzing around, and the frog shoots his tongue out, gets the fly, and pulls it back in. The frog has to shoot the tongue out exactly where the fly is. If the frog believes the fly to be somewhere else, which it's very easy to be inaccurate about that. The frog has to be actually quite accurate to reality to actually get the fly, or else it won't be able to eat and it'll die. Okay, so the action of the tongue shooting out to get the fly has to be it has to correspond to reality very accurately for the frog to survive. And evolution is all about survival of the fittest. So the animals whose actions correspond to reality will be more likely to survive. So therefore, evolution causes your actions to correspond to reality. But the question is, does it cause your beliefs to correspond to reality? That's a different question. Because your beliefs would essentially be blind to the evolutionary process, or the evolutionary process would be blind to what you believe. Like, what difference does it make to the evolutionary process what you believe to be in front of you, what your beliefs are about the external world, as long as your tongue goes out to the right spot? So in other words, the evolutionary process creates your brain, and then your brain causes directly actions. Beliefs are out of that loop. In other words, beliefs are simply content properties associated with the neural states in your brain. They're the content properties of it. They are not the actual... So the neural state just causes the action, but there's also content properties associated with that neural state. Who cares what the content properties are? Like, that doesn't matter. As long as you perform the right action, it doesn't matter. So, like, in other words, this is what I mean by content properties. There is a word in English, and it's the word 9, and it means the number that comes after 8 and before 10. And there is a word in German that is pronounced the exact same way, 9, but it has a totally different content property, or meaning. It means no in English. It means no. So, you have the exact same action, 9, but you have a totally different content property. So, the issue is, there's just no reason for the content properties of your neural states in your brain to correspond to reality, because the beliefs that you hold about reality don't actually cause the actions. It's the neural state that causes the actions directly. Okay? There are two ways to, like, swing it. You could say that, there are separate neural states that are content properties, and then there are other neural states that directly cause action, or there are neural states that just have content property loaded onto them. Either way, it's irrelevant. It's blind to the evolutionary process. And so, Alvin Plantinga is a philosopher at Notre Dame, and he says, if we start to calculate this, and we start to say, and we work on the presumption of foundationalism, then we would say that like people hold basic beliefs, and a basic belief is a belief that like is not founded on other beliefs. But most of the beliefs that we hold are actually not basic beliefs. They're beliefs that rely on other beliefs in a sort of interconnected way. So he says, all right, well, if we take basic beliefs and the set of basic beliefs that we have, like, a basic belief would be, for example, the bowl is in front of me right now. Like, I don't have to, especially I'm experiencing the presence of the bowl in front of me right now, regardless of whether or not it's real. That's very basic. Like, I'm not really grounding that on, what I believe that happened in 1987. It's just the bowl's there, So a basic belief is a belief that's not based on other beliefs. But the point is that most beliefs are not basic beliefs. Most beliefs are grounded in other beliefs. So, like, then the question becomes, all right, let's say that like 75% of your basic beliefs, if we're just lucky and generous, are true. Well, the problem becomes that, like, because so many beliefs are based on other beliefs, then it becomes fantastically improbable that your overall beliefs in general are true. So, to pick any specific belief out of your set of beliefs at random, it's just incredibly improbable that those are true. Unless, of course, the evolutionary process is directed by God. Then all bets are off by that, or you're almost back to a Rene Descartes situation then. So, here's the thing. Why should I give evolution that much credibility? A way to think of this is like evolution is like a strong man who's decided he's going to max out his bench, and he puts like way too much weight on the rack, and he's trying to bench press it. So think about it, the situation with the farmer. You look out in the field and you see a sheep, and you're justified in believing that there's a sheep. Okay? I mean, which you going to go with? Believe in the sheep or not believe in the sheep in the absence of a defeater and in the presence of justification for the sheep? Which should you really go with if you're rational? Okay? But let's say the farmer comes up and gives you a defeater for the presence of the sheep. All right, well, he's a reliable farmer. You know him to be an honest guy, and you know him to be a farmer who knows his farm right, like the back of his hand. He probably knows what he's talking about, whether there's a sheepdog out there. But let's say instead the farmer comes up to you and says, provides for you a defeater for all knowledge in this way, or for such a grand... In other words, I don't think evolution as a defeater can bear the weight. That's a tremendous weight. And really I don't think it can bear the weight of trying to defeat morality. People tend to believe that evolution defeats morality just when they don't want to believe in morality, but most of the time they want to believe in morality. It's usually if you tell them a moral, or you tell them that they're doing something wrong, or that there's something else they should do, and they don't want to do that, then they don't believe in morality. But as soon as you, drop that conversation, then they start moralizing about how these people are wrong, and they ought to do this, and they ought to do that. So, but it's really painfully obvious when you realize that, like, all of our sense experiences, if evolution, in a simple way, if evolution can undercut the moral sense, why can't it undercut over the senses? So, that being said, the point becomes, I think, when you read, it seems that it would have to be the case that when you read the Bible and you read something like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. You read, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You read, think of others more highly than yourself. Things like this. Let's go with just some examples here just to kind of make the point, because these words are written quite well. So here's a good example. 2 Corinthians 4. In this chapter, Paul talks about the level of cost that he's willing to pay to spread the gospel. And the thing about this is we read this and we have a sense of the nobility and sort of the what he's doing is right, and that he is a good person for doing this. because he really believes in what he's doing here. And he's not letting other things, get in the way. What I'm here to say is that sense experience you have about that is rationally justified. And it's just as justified as looking at the bowl on the table in front of you and believing that it's there. So here we go. Therefore, this is chapter 4, verse 1. Therefore, since through God's mercy we have this ministry, we do not lose heart. Rather, we have renounced secret and shameful ways. We do not use deception, nor do we distort the word of God. On the contrary, by setting forth the truth plainly, we commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers, so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For what we preach is not ourselves, but Christ Jesus as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay, he means our bodies, to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. It is written, I have believed, therefore I have spoken. Since we have that same spirit of faith, we also believe and therefore speak, because we know that the one who raised the Lord Jesus from the dead will also raise us with Jesus and present us with you to himself. All this is for your benefit, so that the grace that is reaching more and more people may cause thanksgiving to overflow to the glory of God. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. That is it for this video. Thank you so much for your time. Hey guys, this is Ben, and we're going to come back with a little bit more information in this video. I thought since, due to everything that we talked about, it really made sense to talk about the cultural relativism thing a little bit more, and cover it a little more thoroughly. And so it's really common with teenagers. Like if you're in youth ministry, or you work with teenagers at all, just ask them, do you think morality is subjective or objective? And what I find is like half of them have no idea what I'm talking about, and the other half say it's subjective. And then there's like a tiny category of like one kid that's like, no, it's objective. So anyway, what they're saying is like, okay, there's a red bowl on the table. And if you look at the red bowl on the table, you see the red bowl on the table, no big deal. Essentially, that's the same example I've been using. I see the red bowl on the table, then I'm rationally justified in believing that the red bowl is on the table. But what they're saying is, imagine a table, and there's like 10 people surrounding the table, and then every one of those people is saying something different is on the table. Like one person says there's nothing on the table, another person says there's an aardvark on the table, another person says there's a soccer ball, and every single person sees something different on the table, or at least says they see something different. Then that would function as a pretty powerful defeater that, like, obviously, there's something going on with our ability to see things here. Or at least see what's on this table. So they're saying that similar things are true about morality. So, like, for example, in the example I used before, in the Hindu culture, they would say that it's wrong to free a slave, and in Western culture, well, I think in India they wouldn't say that today, but in ancient Hindu culture, and like before they went through a bunch of changes, basically around 1900s, turn of the century. Before that, they would have said it was wrong to free a slave. Okay, whereas Western culture, said it was wrong long before that, although they had their own struggles with it. So they would say, look at this distinction in morality. You've got one culture over here that says, free the slaves, and another culture over here that says don't free the slaves. And then the addition is like there's been different views on morality throughout history. And so what they're saying is, therefore, since cultures all have like different moral systems, therefore morality itself, the rules of right and wrong, good and evil, laws, all of that is just made up by people. It's not real. Which is a bit of a leap. Just because people disagree, that may be a good reason to think that like we don't really know what is right and what is wrong, and that our moral knowledge isn't really justified knowledge, that it's just something that we, believe but don't actually know. But we could be coming up with the belief some other way other than just making it up. Because that's what subjective means, that like people are just making it up. With that said, the main thing I want to say to you now is that it seems like cultural relativism, like the difference in moral values from culture to culture around the world today and throughout history, it seems like that functions as a good defeater for the moral sense. But that actually it doesn't function as a defeater at all. It's pretty much not a defeater. So the issue is that there is a big difference between looking at a bowl on a table and comparing how sight works in that situation, where like you're literally standing next to a table and there's a red bowl on the table, and you're looking down there and you say, I see a red bowl on the table. Or if you want to use the classic philosophical example, a red apple. I just used red bowl because I was looking at a red bowl earlier in the video. But that's not the same situation as a moral system that a culture will have, because a moral system of a culture is not at the foundation of knowledge. It's not a basic belief. It's built on other beliefs and other inputs and other information. So like by the time you get to specific laws or specific detail what to do in this specific situation, you're very far removed from sort of the basic foundations of that knowledge, even if it's moral knowledge. So, for example, and just to rehearse what we said before, the difference between the Hindu system and the Christian system is not really at the level of morality. It's at the level of reality. In other words, like it's at the ontological level, not the moral level. It's not an ethical difference. It's an existence difference. It's about what is, not about what should be. Remember, morality does not tell you what is, it tells you what ought to be. So like if you look out there into a field and you see someone, murdering a child, ontologically that is happening. The child is being murdered. Ethically or morally, you would say that should not be happening. So there's a class difference between what is and what ought to be. And so my point is, if you can think of knowledge in foundationalism as like a pyramid, then we've got basic beliefs at the bottom of the pyramid, and those basic beliefs are beliefs that are not based on other beliefs. But then you build up from there to get to like more and more detailed beliefs, and your whole culture's moral system and legal system is not a basic belief. It's built on all sorts of other information. So, for example, in the Hindu situation, what they're saying is, at the core, the morality is the same as what the New Testament says. So in the Hindu situation, you've got this idea of karma, and so what they're saying is, hey, you should care about people and do what's best for people because you care about people. The Christian system is actually saying the same thing. But what the Hindu system does is it starts with that same basic idea, but then it's bringing in other information too. That's not really moral information. It's ontological. It's not ought to be. It's is information. It's about what is. It's not about what should be. What they're saying is, this person who was born a slave because of sins they committed in a past life. Therefore, if you were to free that person from slavery, then you would prevent them from fulfilling the payment that they owe, and then they'll just have to pay it again in another life. So the best thing you can do for that person, because you care about that person, is to let them pay for their karma. So that's the Hindu system. Whereas in the Christian system, it's very similar at the foundation, at the foundational moral level. It's the same thing, So it's like you care about a person, but they have additional information where they're coming in and saying, if a person becomes a Christian, the New Testament tells us that now they're a child of God, and therefore you can't be of any higher royal family. You can't really rise beyond that level of royalty. So therefore, how can you enslave royalty? The slave is the lowest member of society, but now everyone has been elevated to this highest level. So at the moral foundation, they're not really all that different. They're just saying care about people. But what's different is like additional information that's not moral information. It's just is information. It's about the way the world is. They think this situation is this, and the other one thinks it is that. So the other example I gave was like, if you have a police officer, the police officer has the same basic moral guideline at the foundation all the time. He just says, keep the community safe. That's his basic, sort of fundamental thing that motivates him in his job. Keep the community safe. So if he sees a woman in labor, so if he sees a car going down the road at a breakneck speed and he knows that a woman in labor is in that car, then he will get in front of the car to clear the way and help them get her to the hospital as quickly as possible. Why? Because she could die and the child could die. They need to get to the hospital so that they can be properly taken care of. So in that situation, he's trying to make the community safe as possible. Whereas if there's some murderous meth head drug dealer in a car going at a breakneck speed down the road, he's actually going to have a different specific moral of like what he's going to think is the right thing to do is going to be stop that car, arrest the person, and take them to the hospital. But don't help them go faster where they're already trying to go. Stop the car. So the specific morality is not the foundational morality. The specific morality is, in one situation it's stop the car, in the other situation it's help the car go faster. But the foundational morality is keep the community safe. So the moral sense works at the level of the foundations. It's not going to tell you like specifics like that. Specifics like that have to bring in other information, specifically ontological information about the way the world is. So for him to know how to apply that foundational moral of keep the community safe, he has to know what dangers are out there. And he has to then address those dangers. So in the one situation, the danger is that the woman is in pregnancy, and there's always a risk associated with pregnancy. In the other situation, we have a drugged out murderous person on the loose, and there's always a danger with someone like that. So he's, the difference is not at the level of foundation. The moral sense doesn't really tell you like super specific details. It works more at the level of the foundation, at the level of the basic belief. So like, again, with the sense of sight, looking at the bowl on the table and seeing the bowl on the table, that's at the more basic level. But, it can get more complicated from there. Like astronomers use their sense of sight and then they argue about what's in another galaxy. But they're bringing all sorts of stuff to bear, and they're arguing also about situations that are very difficult to see. They have to use all sorts of tools. So, but anyway, my first point is, just because cultures have different moral systems in the specifics, into the details of their laws and their rules, that doesn't mean that they actually have a different moral foundation, or even there may not actually be a moral difference. That could be an ontological difference. That could be a difference in terms of in terms of propositions about the way the world is, not propositions about the way the world should be. Okay, so that's the first thing we have to keep in mind. If you're comparing fully developed cultures to each other, you're not talking about the foundations, but the moral sense is what we're really. You can't use that as a defeater for the moral sense, because the moral sense is at the level of foundation. Okay, all right. So there we go. Now you may say to me, like, okay, Ben, I'll grant you that, but still, I can come up with other examples that sit there where there seems to be a difference of opinion at the level of foundation. Like, what about slavery, for example? Just the basic idea that slavery is wrong. So maybe we don't compare it to Hinduism. Maybe we'll make a comparison between, in terms of time, between the modern world in 2000 A.D. The general view. There are people who disagree with this, but the general view across the world is that slavery is wrong. And in 2000 B.C., 4,000 years ago, as far as we know, nobody on this planet had a problem with slavery. So the general view, at the very least back then, was radically different. And so you would say that's kind of more foundational, like no one had a problem, and now everybody sees it as an abomination. Well, what you're doing there is you're failing to recognize, again, it's not really at the level of foundation. There's such a thing as moral progress, advancement in moral knowledge, and sometimes people don't recognize that, like, this is real and this happens. And sometimes they just sort of take it for granted that, like, it's sort of obvious that, like, slavery's wrong, and it's obvious to us today. It's a direct moral sense, and they didn't have that direct moral sense back then, so there's a difference at the level of foundation, and this functions as a defeater for the moral sense. Not so. Because our belief that slavery is wrong today is actually an element of moral progress. It's an achievement of moral knowledge. We do know it, but that doesn't mean that it was super obvious. It was as obvious as the bowl on the table. Okay, so you may say, well, Ben, how is it not obvious that slavery is wrong? Well, the idea that slavery should be abolished it comes from the New Testament. And again, it comes from this idea in the New Testament that, like, first they saw that anyone is in Christ, then they're all a child of God, which brings with it a dual sort of two truths, two propositional truths. One, that all people are equal, human equality, and two, that all people are of, like, basically infinite value, of the highest level of value. So, all people are of equal value, but not that everybody is of zero value, but that everyone is of really, really high value. Okay, so this is where you get the famous phrase from the Three Musketeers, all for one and one for all. That we would all sacrifice ourselves to save one person, because one person is of infinite value, and also the rest of the society, is of infinite value. People are just of that level of value. And then the argument was made in the Middle Ages, around the 1200s, I think by Thomas Aquinas, that since anyone can become a Christian just like that, then it doesn't make sense to say that, like, suddenly they have these human rights that they didn't have, before. Like, it seems kind of stupid. And so the official position of the Catholic Church became that you can't enslave anyone, whereas the Protestants were slower to get on board with that. And the Protestants were a big part of how slavery made a comeback. Although it had been abolished in the Middle Ages, it came back. Whereas the Catholic Church maintained their anti-slavery view, but their voice was silenced within the Catholic world through different kings and queens who were able to sack Rome. Well, Charles V of the Spanish Empire was able to sack Rome and literally banned the Pope from publishing statements. But the Pope kept saying no, no, no to slavery. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. For the purposes of our video, my point is this: human equality is actually a very difficult concept to prove. When you think about it, like, people are obviously not the same, and some people are better looking and some people aren't. People have different abilities. The concept of, and people have different levels of intelligence. Like, the concept of human equality is actually not all that obvious. We all hold it sacred and dear today. But let me make a comparison to something else that, like, people believed in 2000 BC and that they don't believe today. So in 2000 BC, everyone thought the world was flat. We have no evidence that anyone thought anything else. And generally speaking today, there are some people who still think it's flat, but generally speaking, the globe model of the Earth, where it is the spherical model, is generally the prevailing view. Almost everyone holds it. Okay, so obviously we have more detailed information about today than we do about 2000 BC. But generally speaking, there's a radical change. And you say, well, isn't it obvious that the Earth is round? Well, it's actually not all that obvious. You can't really fault people in 2000 BC for thinking it's flat. I mean, doesn't it look flat? If you weren't taught in school that it's round, wouldn't you think it was flat? And it wasn't until 1,500 years later, in 500 BC, when the first scientists published, they had figured out that it was round, that the Earth is round, and they had to think really hard about it, and they had to, like, reason and make all sorts of careful measurements over long periods of time in different places, and they were able to prove that, like, yeah, it clearly has to be round. And they knew it was round. They proved it. But it wasn't like at the level, it wasn't a basic belief. It wasn't like a directly observed thing. It's not like the bowl on the table. If you just look at the Earth directly, it seems pretty flat. Okay. Lumpy, but generally speaking, flat. You wouldn't think that, like, oh, actually, it's like this. That the interesting thing about the Earth is, this is what I've seen. Neil deGrasse Tyson's a physicist. He said this, that the Earth is actually so smooth. It's just so big that, like, if you were to, like, make a pool ball, the smoothest possible pool ball that we can make, and you were to make that pool ball the size of the Earth, then the little scratches and bumps on the pool ball would be bigger than the highest mountain on Earth and deeper than the lowest trench. That the Earth is actually incredibly smooth, but it's just so gigantic that, like, it's hard for us to comprehend things on that scale. So my point is that, like, there can be moral progress, moral innovation, where people come to realize that, like, really human equality is a generally accepted moral premise, and human value is not as accepted. You'll find a lot of people still to this day don't believe in the idea, that they say, hey, if I have to kill, 50 people, at least I'm saving 100 million, so it's worth it. Whereas the foundational idea in the New Testament is that all people are, of the highest level of value, so that, like, you can't add up, 10 people over here and one person over here, because they all it just adds up to infinity each time. Infinity equals infinity. The point is that just because highly developed moral systems have differences, really contentious differences in their morals, it doesn't mean that, like, they're just making it up. There's such a thing as moral progress. There's such a thing as moral advancement and knowledge. So, like, again, the cultural relativism just is not going to function very well as a defeater for the objective moral sense that you have, that, like, you just have this sense experience. Ask yourself, do you have this sense experience? If you were to see someone murdering a child, would you recoil at that? Would you think this is wrong? Okay. the fact that different cultures have different views on that, again, that's bringing into it a higher degree of complication. We're talking at the level of the moral sense, we're talking about the basic sense experience of the wrongness of someone murdering a child. So, last point, I guess, is to help us kind of wrap this up, is that people have a tendency to think that proof is always obvious, and that there's no such thing as proof that you have to think about. And they sort of fall into that trap, especially when they don't want to accept something. But then when there's something else they believe in, and somebody disagrees with that, they don't think it. So for example, when it comes to the roundness of the earth, people are okay with like the fact that you have to think about it, you have to use special tools, make special measurements, people are okay with the fact that you have to think about the proof. But then when we talk about something else like morality, is not really subjective, they just want to say, oh, your proof ought to be obvious or I don't believe it. So a lot of times when you disagree with someone, they want you to refute them with like a super obvious proof, or else they won't accept it. But then if the shoe's on the other foot, then they want you to be willing and open to think really hard about what they have to say, And the fact of the matter is, oftentimes we can know things and have really good knowledge, like that the earth is round, but you have to think about it. So classic example I like to use is, let's say that let's say that we're sitting in your living room and I told you that there's a pink elephant in the living room right now. Okay, so the justification you have that there's no pink elephant in the living room is basically all your senses. You would probably feel the elephant, you would smell the elephant, you would see all sorts of result. You would see the elephant, but the elephant would be damaging things. You would hear the elephant. You could probably feel its breath on you, which, the justification for the proposition that there's no pink elephants in the living room is so strong that it's very difficult for you to believe anything else. It's very difficult for you to believe in the pink elephant. It basically compels you to believe in the absence of the pink elephant. But it is possible that like you could convince yourself that there is a pink elephant in the living room if you like worked really hard at it and came up with all kinds of like crazy rationalizations, and conspiracy theories and things. You could probably convince yourself in the presence of the pink elephant. But my point is that there are situations where the justification for your belief is so strong that it's compelling. Whereas when it comes to human equality and, the high level of value of each human, that was something that like took effort to demonstrate and to convince people of. It didn't happen overnight. It's not like, the absence of pink elephants in your bedroom. So another example I like to give is, let's say that someone came to you and told you that, he doesn't believe in God, and you would say, well, why don't you believe in God? What is, why not? And the guy would say, well, I don't know if God exists or not, but I don't believe in God because I don't think there's any way to know if God exists, and that there's no way to know anything. You can't know anything about God because God would be beyond our comprehension, right? The idea of God as a being that's beyond our comprehension. Look at what we say in worship songs and in the Bible. God is indescribable, unfathomable. God is beyond us, so far beyond us. So if God is so far beyond us, then how could we even comprehend the word God? How do we even know what the word God means? So therefore, there's no way you can know anything about God, really. So therefore, you can't really know if God exists. So therefore, everyone should just say, I don't know if God exists. I'm going to withhold belief. And so therefore, they don't believe in God because there's no evidence for God's existence. Because how could there be? Because then if you had evidence for God's existence, that means that you have to know things about God. And you can't possibly know anything about God because God would be so far beyond us. And that may sound like it makes a lot of sense, right? But if you actually put some effort into thinking about it, it actually falls apart. It falls dead on its face. This is the problem. That perspective is called hard agnosticism. And what it does is it actually is self-defeating or self-refuting. It literally affirms what it denies. It affirms as true one thing and then denies it at the exact same time. It's self-contradictory, because what it's saying is it knows about God, that God is it knows this about God. What do you know about God? That God is unknowable. So if God is so unknowable, how do you know that God is unknowable? I guess we'd have to conclude that there's no way you could know that God is unknowable, because when you say that, you're claiming to know something about God. How could you know that? The only way you could know that is if it's possible to know something about God. So therefore, you can't know that God's unknowable. You may not know anything about God, or you may know something about God, but you can't know. It's logically impossible to know that you can't know anything about God. So this is the error of hard agnosticism. And what this means is, I've just given you an argument and a view that some people will hold, and it seems like a really good idea, but it's actually so logically flawed, it's a formal logical fallacy, that it actually isn't. We can be 100% certain that it's wrong. 100%. We have certainty that it's impossible. So my point is, you can have knowledge that you have to think about. The same thing can be true. The same thing is true with science and our knowledge about the shape of the earth. The same thing can be true about morality. Moral knowledge, typically, the way that moral insight has developed is when people propose different moral situations. And in some cases, there's an ontological distinction, like with the Christian thing about becoming children of God. And there were other Bible verses that were brought to bear, and other arguments were brought to bear. And people, how ethical philosophy works, it has ways of how, it goes about these things. But anyway, the point is that cultural relativism does not in the least function as a defeater for the moral sense. So, again, let's think about the example of the red bowl on the table. Let's say there's 10 people standing around the table. You see the red bowl on the table, and everyone else sees the red bowl on the table. And one guy says he doesn't see the red bowl on the table. You would probably think that maybe that guy has an issue. Okay. Now, if no one is ever able to agree and there's billions of people on the planet, and they all try to take a look at the red bowl and everyone sees something different, that would be an issue. But I don't think that's where we're at. I don't see any good argument for that being where we're at. Really think about, how would you go about defending the idea of human equality? You probably believe in human equality. You probably get offended when people don't believe in human equality. How dare they? But how would you go about defending that idea? It's actually a very difficult idea to defend. It actually takes effort. You actually have to think about it. You have to be careful, rigorous, perhaps even a bit boring and tedious. And if you've made it through this video, then you're willing to sit through something very boring and tedious. But nonetheless, hopefully it was rewarding. And I've said all the things that I had planned to say. And so we'll stop saying things. Thank you for your time.